An Illinois bill that helps protect survivors of domestic violence officially got Governor J.B. Pritzker's signature Monday morning.
Karina's law now requires police to confiscate guns from alleged abusers who have an order of protection against them. The law also allows anyone seeking an order of protection to ask a judge to issue a search warrant. It allows police to take guns from the alleged abuser as long as they show cause. The law was named after Karina Gonzalez after she and her daughter were shot and killed in 2023 by her husband.
Taking lethal weapons from those who have already done harm and are an immediate and present danger to do further harm is simply common sense. Confiscating weapons from dangerous individuals is too important a task to carry out without the proper resources.